Hello and welcome to this week's bonus episode of Planet Critical, a podcast for a world in crisis. My guest this week was Jessie Henshaw. Jessie's a physicist and an architect, and she works on understanding natural systems and how to design better systems. She worked with the UN on their sustainability development goals. She helps organizations all around the world understand their natural processes and how to modify them. And like any systems thinker, she's deeply concerned with the state of the world and what's going to happen in the coming decades. We discussed a lot of things together. We discussed the contradictions of the crisis. We discussed going beyond the binary, that growth is an inherent part of life and that growth is good if it's cyclical. She gives these 3 stages to growth: innovation, maturation, and long life. And right now we're sort of stuck, or capitalism has us stuck in that innovation stage. And interestingly enough, immediately that makes you think of the word sustainability, doesn't it? Sustaining life, sustaining ecosystems, getting past that explosive growth that defines innovation. And I really liked that idea of re-examining growth and redefining it. At the very beginning of the episode, Jessie talks about a Black Lives Matter activist who's currently saying that we need to discuss people's aspirations rather than their disabilities or the flaws of a system as well. That's what she was applying it to. And I think that that's crucial right now. This has come up a lot in the past few episodes, since Alice Friedman's episode in particular about a post-carbon world and hope for a post-carbon world. Right now, the message that is sold, even often by climate activists, is that this way of running the world is exploitative and going to ruin us. But the alternative is a huge reduction, a huge necessary reduction in what we understand our, I want to say social life, but not so superficial, to be. The truth of the matter, of course, is that there are multiple outcomes for the next few decades. It depends on which part of the crisis hit first and how we handle one and how we engender other problems. But for me, as somebody who's obsessed with words as a writer, I often talk about how we market the climate crisis. How do we get more people involved? How do we get more people on board? How do we suggest to people that this could be better for them? Degrowth scholars say that a kind of eco-socialism will lift everybody out of poverty. Fantastic. But for a huge chunk of the world for whom that seems too radical a change, now I know we need radical change, but bear with me, perhaps, as Jessie says, re-examining and redefining the limits of these words and what they mean might be really, really helpful. So, imagine that if you're really involved in the discussion of the climate crisis, having a systems thinker saying like not all growth is bad, it's quite a claim right now, isn't it? And to have that tied in more with natural processes like life, birth, death, to emphasize the fact that all systems are cyclical, and that essentially part of the problem with the system that we're in today, certainly the economic system, is it's constantly thrusting towards exponential growth. We know that, right? Well, what if we could grow and then things could collapse softly? Not all of society collapsing, but in the same way death comes for any natural process. It has to shift. And this is the thing. Jessie says at the beginning of the episode, and it's really stuck with me, that our obsession with one kind of growth means that we're also missing out on many other kinds of growth. There are natural systems that we're getting in the way of developing and evolving because of this constant thrusting for a specific kind of growth. I kind of identified it as GDP or an economic growth. I think she was actually being much more metaphorical even than just that. An ecosystem is a relationship of multiple systems within systems within systems, right? If we're trying to cut a linear propulsion through that, then not only are we, if you want to follow the image right through to its logical conclusion, dissecting ecosystems, ripping them apart, penetrating them, that very creative power is destructive in its nature. We are fraying the very threads that connect ecosystems together. And she says that later on in the interview, that there's this battle between economists. I think it was capitalism. Is capitalism creative destruction or destructive creation? Was it capitalism, innovation, something like that? Is it creative destruction or destructive creation? And now we're veering towards destructive creation. And I think, again, that's very useful when thinking about what I kind of started this with and what Jessie and I discussed throughout, this idea of binaries, of the crisis being so complicated that we have to move beyond the myths that keep us thinking there's only two sides to every coin. Because right now, the coin is in the air and the light is refracting all over the place and creating patterns all over our environment and making it very, very difficult to see. We're sort of blinded by how complicated it is. And I think destructive creation is such a good example of seemingly opposite things being true at the same time. Creation can be destructive. We're currently in a paradigm of creating either for destruction or creating that has a net destructive result. And even that's interesting, because that's what so much of the climate promises hinge on, right? Net zero carbon, net zero whatever. Well, what if we applied net positive to the majority of life, to life itself, to ecosystems? That net positive wasn't just the GDP, what's going on Wall Street, but it's the net positive for the most people around the world, for the most species. I mean, if you started to use that net whatever reasoning to its logical conclusion, pretty quickly capitalism and those that espouse capitalism as the solution, they run out of place to hide, right? Anything that benefits only a minority has a net negative result, whether that's humanity as the minority of all the other species on the planet, whether it's the West versus the billions of other people around the world, whether it's the 1% of the West versus those living in precarity in the world's richest nations. Maybe that could be interesting. I don't know. I'm tangenting now, thinking about marketing again. I would love to know what you think, both of what I've been discussing here and of the conversation Jessie and I have. You can find the link to the episode in the description box below if you haven't watched it already. So leave a comment with what you think. Also, if there's somebody that you want me to interview, a topic that you want me to cover on the show, just let me know. If you're new here, you can find out more about the project at planetcritical.com. You can subscribe there or, of course, on this YouTube channel. If you're a long-time listener to Planet Critical and you're really enjoying the podcast, please do consider taking out a paid subscription at planetcritical.com or supporting the project on Patreon. All the links are in the description box below. And a huge thank you and shout out to everyone who is supporting the project and making it possible. Thank you everyone for watching. I hope this was useful in some way, and I will see you next week.